In 1874, a Russian physiologist studying digestive responses in dogs stumbled across one of the most important discoveries in psychology. His name was Ivan Pavlov, and his work led him to receiving the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his scientific studies into the digestive process. Initially, he believed that salivation was a reflexive, automatic response to the production of food, or even the smell of food. However, he began to realize that dogs would begin to salivate even in the absence of food or the smell of food, and therefore this was not an automatic physiological process. Although there are several theories on this, the most common is that during the course of his studies, he recognized that his dogs would begin to salivate just prior to his assistant coming in to feed the dogs, and this would directly coincide with the ringing of a bell, which instructed the assistant to commence the feeding process. Based on his observations, Pavlov recognized that salivation was indeed what he termed to be a learned response, in that the ringing of the bell always preceded food. He then went on to discover how these responses were learned and effectively outlined the concepts of classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is a science, and Pavlov spent many years studying its consequences and its potential. And as such, it contains many terms we would not readily recognize, such as neutral stimulus, conditioned response, and unconditioned stimulus. To some people, this may be fascinating, and to others, it may leave them totally cold. However, understanding the first principle of classical conditioning is fundamental to our understanding of how dogs learn. One of the commonest problems that I'm asked to deal with or give advice on is the issue of dogs having selective hearing, or in some cases, being accused of being deaf. In my opinion, perhaps 90% of low-level behavioural issues in dogs could be resolved by teaching the dog to respond to its name with the simple application of classical conditioning. If we go back to Pavlov, he proved that the production of food, when linked to a specific sound, which in his case was a ringing bell, would virtually guarantee the same response every time, which in his case was salivation. So, if we look at this from a dog owner's perspective, if we replace the ringing of the bell with the sound that represents the dog's name, the response we would create is that the dog would engage with us every time if we produce the food reward after saying its name. This means that we could potentially stop a great many inappropriate behaviours by using the dog's name, because it would recognise that its name means just one thing, and that's food. And this is termed as a learned behaviour. So, if your dog is digging up the garden, you could call it to you with a food reward, thus stopping the behaviour. If your dog is barking in the garden at some known threat, we could call him or her in for a food reward, thus stopping the barking. Running at the front door when somebody rings the bell could be approached in the same way, as could jumping on visitors to your home. To achieve this level of response, you have to be in a position to give your dog a food reward every time you say its name. Now, when I say this to people, they sometimes look at me as though I'm stupid. But why is this so difficult? Classical conditioning is not an opinion. It's a science, and if applied appropriately, it will work. However, the more times you call your dog's name without providing a food reward, the more your dog will potentially ignore you.